Hello, NG Houston. So tonight, we were supposed to do this last week, but we got rescheduled because we had a hurricane in Houston. So tonight we're very excited to be starting off with Denny's AngularJS to Angular Upgrade series. So Denny, I'm going to let you run the show, so take it away.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I know we had a false start last week, so sorry about that with the hurricane. I actually lost power here at the house and had rising floodwaters in front of the house just a week ago. So it's nice to actually be in my office here with power and dry streets outside. So thanks anyway for your patience. Thanks everybody. We've got a great set of panelists tonight, and let's go through them and let them introduce themselves. So go ahead, David, introduce yourself.
Hey, so my name's Dave Owen. I work for Thomson Reuters Tax and Accounting, and I head up the front-end framework initiative to standardize all of our enterprise products on a single set of front-end stacks. And today that stack is Angular and AngularJS.
Great. So thanks for joining us. So Paul, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Paul Spears. I work at Oasis Digital, and I also am one of the lead instructors for Angular Bootcamp. And we do front-end development for many different clients, front-end, back-end, full-stack development for many different clients. Most of our front-end work, though, ends up being implemented in Angular.
Great. Thanks for joining us tonight. We also have Jack with us tonight as well. Say a few words, Jack.
Hey everybody, my name is Jack Balbus. I work at Oasis Digital with Paul, and I am also an Angular Bootcamp instructor.
Okay, great. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. We have a lot to get through tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Okay, so let me know, guys, can you see my screen?
Yeah, I was worried about you for a minute there. It went blue and I didn't hear anything, but we're good now.
Okay, great. So we're here tonight to start our upgrade from AngularJS to Angular series. And in our first session tonight, we're going to go ahead and just introduce the series and let you guys know why we're here and what kind of led to this series. So tonight what we want to do is take a look at the history. You know, where have we been the past couple of years with respect to AngularJS and Angular, and what do we have planned? And then we want to take a look at what's going on currently in the Angular world and in industry in general, now that Angular has been out for almost a year. And then we want to go ahead and cover our agenda and let you guys know what to expect out of this series, what you'll walk away with. And then we also want to talk about the considerations for whether or not to upgrade at all. So for me, it was about a couple of years ago in 2015 when I was hearing a lot about AngularJS, and I started playing around with the framework and getting excited about the possibilities for the projects I had in mind. So I had some experience using Sencha's XJS 3.4 to produce some kind of sophisticated data-driven UIs in JavaScript. And then of course I was familiar with jQuery for handling a lot of my data loading operations. But I was really impressed with AngularJS and excited by the simplified interface and that declarative syntax for doing that same kind of operations to get my data into my views. So I started learning about all of these terms that were involved with AngularJS. You know, of course, $scope and custom directives and factories and services, and trying to figure out the differences between those. And I followed a lot of the blog articles. I think I was about a couple of years late into the game with AngularJS, so there had already been some shifting opinions and some articles that would highlight some of the differences and tried to teach us some of these nuances of AngularJS. So I would bury myself in online videos and read some of the docs that were online and go through those courses that were online. And of course, I joined this local meetup group, NG Houston. And I heard at that time even that Angular 2 was coming. But I thought, well, I'm just learning AngularJS, and I still have quite a bit of time. So I kind of had this growth chart in mind for myself where over the subsequent 2 years, I would develop this expertise in these different AngularJS concepts. And by the end of that 2 years, I figured I'd be pretty proficient as an AngularJS developer. And everything looked really good. I thought everything I was seeing said AngularJS was highly in demand. There was growing demand for it in the marketplace, and I was learning it and starting to use it for my day job and really enjoying it. But still, I continued to see things and hear about this Angular 2. So I still figured, well, I'll get to it in a couple of years. I mean, I don't want to jump ship before it's even complete. And I really did want to establish myself as an AngularJS developer first. But then I saw this statement at some point from the Angular team that said that this isn't a major change release. It's an entire rewrite. So that raised some red flags in my mind, and I started to worry a little bit and wonder, is this going to impact my plan for the next couple of years, right, to stick with AngularJS? And then there was NGconf 2 years ago. So it was in May of 2016. And even at the very first meetup that I attended here in Houston, our organizer, Bonnie, was already raving about the world's premier annual Angular conference in Utah. And I was really excited because it was going to be the first time that they were going to live stream the entire conference. So I tuned in. And what I heard from those talks were terms like tooling, annotations, pipes, observables, TypeScript, and this ES6, which was relatively new even at that point in my mind, or in my world of development. So I watched this whirlwind of talks, and what I didn't hear were all of those terms that I was planning to get really familiar with over the following 2 years. I didn't hear anything about controllers, Angular.module, so that raised my concern even more. So I was working for a company that is using AngularJS, but I realized, well, we may need to make some plans to address this as an organization a lot more quickly than I had in mind. So our group, NG Houston, had to decide how we would respond to this. We figured we had several options. One was to completely abandon Angular, which didn't seem reasonable because it had a lot of power, got a lot of use from it. The other was to just switch to Angular 2, but that was still in beta at the time, and that didn't seem reasonable, especially since my job was still involved daily working with AngularJS. We were still building new features in AngularJS. So we had to figure out, well, how do we continue to deepen our AngularJS proficiency while still learning about Angular 2 so that we're ready when it comes to market. So we decided on a plan that's in front of you, which was we'll start with some AngularJS app, and we'll go ahead and study these Angular 2 concepts and the ecosystem that was talked about quite a bit at that NGconf 2016. And then we'll go ahead and try to transform that app into an Angular 2 code base. Now, at the time, it was pretty scary because we really didn't know if it was even possible, right? So we didn't know what we would learn or if we could even do this. So what we did learn was, though, over the course of the 6 months that we went through the process, is there really are many differences between AngularJS and this Angular 2. But it really was possible to migrate an existing app to Angular 2. So that was really the good news. And in fact, it turned out there were multiple migration paths. So there was some flexibility there even. The other thing that really stood out during that process was that we learned that learning Angular 2 and its concepts was really synonymous with learning about the future of web application development. So when the Angular team designed Angular 2, they were aiming for the future. So they were kind of targeting what's the future of web development going to look like, and how can we make this Angular 2 the platform to be there in advance, almost to facilitate or speed up reaching that future point. So what I mean by that, or how they did that, was they included these concepts of web components, ECMAScript, and reactive programming. And web components is a set of standards that isn't finalized yet. So that's really an emerging set of standards that we'll be using to help create portable pieces of functionality that we can spread across different web applications and across the net. So Angular 2 is built in a way that allows us to adopt the architectural principles behind web components. And of course, ECMAScript 6 or ES6 is also a key part of the future of just JavaScript programming in general. So that's what we did a year ago at this time. Now we want to figure out, well, what's going on now? We're a year later, and myself included, a lot of us out there in industry are kind of caught hanging on to an already proven AngularJS code base, but we're wondering, what is it that we can do to upgrade it, or should we? So in fact, on Twitter, the Angular team back in May recently released their May minutes, and in those May minute notes, they pointed out that they're receiving a ton of requests from people out there just wondering, well, how do I upgrade from AngularJS to Angular? And Brad Green, who's the Angular project manager, he himself asked for help from groups like ours to help people migrate from AngularJS to Angular. So that's why we're here in this series, is we are going to take a look at how can we help people out there with their apps really finally move from AngularJS to Angular. So before we go much further, I want to point out how we are going to talk about Angular throughout this series. Back at NGconf 2016, we were still talking about these two different versions as either AngularJS 1.x or Angular 2, which had yet to be released at the time. But at the most recent NGconf, the team announced that the two versions will be discussed as either AngularJS or Angular going forward. So we're not going to talk about the version numbers when we're referring to the two different versions of the framework any longer. And the reason for that is that the Angular platform or framework has adopted a scheduled release cycle. So that version number is going to increment as time passes. So unlike the first jump from Angular 1x to Angular 2, which took maybe a couple of years, the jump in major releases is going to occur, I believe, every 6 months now, with some minor releases each month. So because of that, I believe by the time we conclude this series, we'll actually be at Angular 5. I think right now the current version is Angular 4. So it doesn't make sense to call it Angular 2. So for the remainder of the series, just keep that in mind. When we mention AngularJS, we're talking about version 1.x. And when we talk about Angular by itself, we're talking about the latest version of the platform. So now I want to take a look at what we're going to cover throughout this series and talk about our objectives. So first, our first session here is our series introduction, which we're in the midst of now. And then next we want to take a look at AngularJS versus Angular concepts. So I want to put those concepts side by side and see how we can view Angular and think about Angular, given that we know AngularJS well at this point. Our third session, we're going to see the tools and the approach to developing Angular is very different from that of AngularJS. We'll introduce some of the tools and show how to use them. And then in our fourth session, we're going to talk about the architecture of Angular versus the AngularJS application. Because one of the key things we'll need to do as developers is to think about the way we compose our Angular applications very differently from how we compose them now using AngularJS. And in our fifth session, we're going to take a look at how we can actually run an Angular app that has some AngularJS code and some Angular code at the same time. The Angular framework or platform actually provides us with a module and a library to help us do that. So we have a way we can almost scaffold the two different versions of the framework together and then run the two code bases together at the same time. And then in our final session, example migrations, we're going to feature the Rosetta project, which is a wonderful public repository that's authored by one of our panelists, David Owens, that exemplifies a code base as it goes through its transformation process. So we're hoping you'll walk away with these things. So number one is you're going to have the information you need to make a plan to upgrade your own app. So you'll understand how to bridge the gaps between your AngularJS work you're familiar with and Angular. And then you'll be able to use some of those Angular concepts to feel more comfortable getting started with it and feel confident in applying those concepts with those tools to actually produce Angular application code. And then with both of those together, you should be able to lead an effort, whether personally or on your team, to actually migrate code from AngularJS to Angular. So before we start actually upgrading, we want to think about what we need to even make a plan. So I think that starts with one question that's likely growing in most of our minds, which is, should I even upgrade at all? So let's draw out some of the things we should think about when making that decision. The first area of things to consider are the application considerations. So first and foremost, what's the status of your app? Is it nearing the end of its life? For example, if it's something like Internet Explorer browser versus the Edge browser from Microsoft, it may not make sense to upgrade it at all. It may be near the end of its life cycle. Or is your app in its early stage of production? In that case, you might consider jumping to Angular after we talk about some of the concepts here. Or if you have a complex app running in production or expected to launch soon, you'll also be able to use some of the information we have here to make a plan to upgrade. The next thing we want to think about is the roadmap for your application. Are there any new features under development currently or planned that might be better suited using an Angular implementation? You know, knowing some of the new things about Angular, some of the things it can do, might that feature be better as an Angular implementation versus AngularJS? Or is there some simple or isolated new feature that could serve as a good candidate for an Angular implementation rather than an AngularJS implementation in your app that you're extending? Next thing you want to think about are the third-party dependencies. So does your app depend upon any third-party AngularJS libraries or components? If so, you'll need to see if they're available in Angular. If not, is there some replacement for that functionality available? Then you also want to consider the maintenance plans for the app. How do you currently or plan to manage the application once it is in production? How will your development resources be notified to handle AngularJS work versus Angular work during the migration process? The next area that you want to consider is in the development team. And first would be the team interest and their capabilities. So ask your team members how they feel about learning the new technology. Now, I don't think this would be an issue for many developers who are working with Angular because they mostly love learning new technology. But you want to ask them, and it'll help you allocate resources towards the areas of work that align most closely with each developer's interests. And perhaps some of your team members are already learning the new platform, and those might be good resources to tap immediately to help with an upgrade. Next thing you'll need to consider is the required training. So as you'll see later in this series, there's a new language and new technologies that must be learned in order to do Angular development. So you'll have to make a plan for how your resources will get the training needed to do that. If you're managing developers, you'll need to determine how to verify that they're progressing in their training. For instance, if they're all assigned to take an online course, maybe you could monitor and ensure that they've completed that course. The next development team consideration is the environment. You'll need to make sure that your developers have the tools that they need to develop. Those are pretty widely available and well integrated into most code editors and IDEs. They're not difficult to come by, but you'll need to check with the team and make sure that they have those things. And lastly, you'll need to organize the people, time, and the energy you spend to actually make an upgrade happen. It'll require some routine overhead and certainly communication to make sure that a upgrade process is transpiring as planned. It's going to increase in complexity with the larger team that you have, but use whatever communication system you already have in place to organize that process. So I know, David, you've had some experience thinking about how to work with your development teams and considering your applications. Do you have anything that you'd like to add from your experience on these topics?
Sure. Specifically speaking to the training aspect and the skills aspect of, I would say, either migrating to Angular front-end development as a whole or migrating from AngularJS to Angular. They're similar propositions. What we find quite often is that developers, much like myself and probably most of the people on the phone, are full stack, right? And I spent a lot of time in the 90s doing SQL, lots of other time doing ASP, ASP.NET, VB, lots of C#, and Silverlight. So the transition into the current front end skill set can be daunting. I know there's a couple of things you're holding out on talking about in terms of the languages, so I'll let you get to those for the Angular portion. But the concepts can be daunting. The build tools can be daunting. Concept of using Grunt or Webpack or Gulp, along with just the concepts of learning Node, NPM, maybe Git stuff. All those things are a lot. So taking a concerted effort to making sure that all those skills are made available and clearly defined, that's been a big help for us. I handle that in Thompson. That's one of the core functions I've got, is identifying these patterns and training them, disseminating them. That's why I've got a whole bunch of reference material out on site. But I'd say in general that the hardest part is describing the overall landscape of front-end development, since it is so different and it changes all the time. Picking the core pieces that you're most familiar with or you feel are most important, and then getting the team to the point where they've bought in and are able to be functional, so that they're not getting pulled into distractions, trying to figure out my NPM isn't working properly, or I can't configure Bower to pull things down. The sidetrack stuff is easy to get caught up on, and it'll detract from the core skill set.
Great. Thanks for that, David.
Of course.
So the next thing we'll need to consider if we're thinking about whether or not to upgrade is the costs. And I think the costs are largely in the time invested. So that time investment is going to incur in a couple of areas. The first of which is that learning curve. So the learning curve is going to start with learning just Angular concepts versus that AngularJS familiarity that we have. So I think this is going to be one of the most challenging for those of us coming from the AngularJS background, because we have preconceived notions of how to approach app design and issues using AngularJS. So we might need to unwind or replace some of that thinking with a new way. It might be easier for somebody with no AngularJS experience to simply adopt Angular view, after reading through the Angular docs. But I would say that this could potentially be the most rewarding for us familiar with AngularJS, because I think we'll appreciate the simplicity and the improvements that the Angular team has made through that comparison with what we know of AngularJS. The other thing we'll need to learn is the new programming language. We have to learn TypeScript, which is that superset of JavaScript, includes a lot of ES6 concepts. We have to learn that to be most effective in Angular development. And then, more importantly, we'll have to learn the value of and habit of declaring types for variables in source code. I think that this is a big jump from traditional JavaScript programming, which many might be reluctant to do, who are coming straight from a front-end development background. But what I've noticed is that most people, once they have started using TypeScript as developers, really understand the benefits quickly and adopt the philosophy quickly. So if you are reluctant to use it, just have some faith that many have gone before you under the same mindset, and many have learned to appreciate the value in strong typing of your code. So the other thing we'll need to learn is this new development environment, some of which David just spoke to us about, the build tools and some other tools that we'll cover later in the series. I will say most of the IDEs and the code editors that I've seen have wonderful integration already built into them to do Angular development, but you will have to learn at least the concepts and understand where that stuff is coming from in your development environment. So the other, yeah,
about the learning
sure,
curve?
sure.
So I feel pretty strongly about this because I taught myself AngularJS all by myself back in 2013. And back then I didn't know about Dan Mullion or John Popper. I didn't know about Pluralsight. I had never heard of Todd Motto. So the only thing that I had was the AngularJS docs, right? It was really hard. The learning curve, I mean, I really liked Angular, and I had a lot of enthusiasm for AngularJS because NG repeat, right, was just the coolest thing ever. So I liked it a lot, but when I tried to do more advanced things like custom directives and custom filters and things like that, I struggled a lot to learn it. So the learning curve was pretty steep, even though it was very cool. We just didn't really have the materials and training videos like we do now. But my experience, even aside from that, aside from all of the training materials that are out there, which makes it so much easier because you can just go watch a video, there's so many cool blog posts. I really feel that learning Angular was 100 times easier than learning AngularJS, because the whole language, including the TypeScript and all of the way that this stuff needs to be written, it's so much simpler. There's so much less code. And maybe, I don't know, it was because I came from AngularJS to Angular 2 or to the newer Angular, but I really feel like the learning curve was a lot steeper on AngularJS. So if you went through all that, it's like that, what do you call it? The lost time fallacy, right? Well, I don't want to change because I spent all this time learning this. Well, I did too. I spent a lot of time learning it, and it was difficult, but I kept using it because it was really cool. But when I upgraded, when I started learning the newer stuff, I love it. It's like a breath of fresh air because it's so much simpler and there's so much out there. So the learning curve for Angular, I think, is much less than the learning curve. And one more thing that I didn't want to sidetrack you, but I wanted to throw this in as well. back in 2013, when I first started doing Angular JS, was when SharePoint 2013 came out, and there were a lot of us in oil and gas doing enterprise stuff, enterprise SharePoint stuff, where we really needed to write Microsoft. So we were trying to get a lot of .NET code ported over to JavaScript so that we could use it on the cloud, which was brand new, right? And it was very difficult because I was trying to teach AngularJS to .NET developers, and it was just really different from what they were used to. But then going back and teaching the newer version of Angular to people coming from Java or C or .NET from those different types of languages, it seems like it's a lot easier. So if you have a background in Java or .NET or any of those back-end languages, I think that the TypeScript and the newer syntax is actually going to be a lot more intuitive to you. And so if you did look at AngularJS back then and you come back and look at the newer stuff, I think you would like it a lot. And even if you learned AngularJS, like the point that I wanted to make is the learning curve, to me, in my opinion, is much, much easier for Angular 2 because not Angular 2, but the newer Angular, because there are so many resources out there. And honestly, the code is simpler, cleaner, easier, and it's beautiful. But anyway, I'll let you. I didn't want to sidetrack you, but I wanted to throw that in there.
No, that's great, Bonnie. I appreciate that. That really helps.
You mind if I add one more sentence to that, like along the same lines of Bonnie there, is that like I like to think of it as almost like Angular is AngularJS, the good parts. It kind of takes the core heart of like what made AngularJS awesome and then kind of wraps it in what you were mentioning earlier about this is kind of like them aiming at the future. And so it's, kind of distills away some of the uncertainty that you have around AngularJS and how to use it, and kind of leaves it with just that core idea. So I think you're going to get into that. So we'll see.
Yep. Thanks, Paul.
To add another sentence to that, all the things that you've outlined here in this circle, even if Angular wasn't a thing, I would say that they would be something you should be learning about anyway. So even if you weren't learning them to make the jump from AngularJS to Angular, it would still be worthwhile to learn these concepts. So TypeScript, the updated development environment with like Webpack and those kinds of things, and then the architecture of Angular applications as it's done in AngularJS are all very valuable things, even if you're still in the AngularJS world.
I look at it like this. I had explained this. I think I did a talk for one of the universities here about a year ago, and it was, for a long time, JavaScript was only the only things that you could really do with JavaScript when I first learned about JavaScript, which was a while back, was mouse over effects and hover, and we had a little bit of jQuery, but there wasn't really a whole lot. And if you really wanted to have serious business logic and this business functionality, you really needed to handle all of that on the server. And JavaScript was really only for front end bling, drop down menus and stuff like that. We weren't able to do all of that stuff until Nodejs came along, and it just gave us so much more functionality. Well, then once we have Angular, once we have Node.js, and we can do that server-side functionality on the front end, then we started building bigger applications. And once we started building bigger applications, then we started coming into the architectural concerns. And I think that's kind of how they evolved into Angular. Once you have that, you need that structure when you have the larger applications.
So one more comment since we're doing the roundtable thing here. I wanted to comment on Denny. You'd said what are reasons to upgrade, and you've listed quite a few good ones. And I would say along the lines of what everybody else has commented on in terms of improvements, the integration aspect of Angular over AngularJS is remarkably tighter. It's one of the things that I find makes me much more productive. The fact that I need to actually declare where things are coming from, as opposed to depending on the magic of dependency injection. Stipulating where these things are coming from, knowing where they are, declaring them using the ng module patterns. That all keeps things much tighter, forces you to do it, and also forces your teams to scale appropriately so that they're all thinking the same way. How am I going to get this? How are we going to share this component across pieces? How are we going to pull these modules in? So that's one of the biggest improvements I think that Angular tends to offer. and a good reason why, from a development team perspective, you would want to move to this. And I personally took all the things that I learned through the NG Rosetta piece and backported them into our AngularJS patterns. So I now have a custom Yeoman generator that I wrote that scaffolds a project using Webpack and TypeScript in the AngularJS component patterns.
I think at one point I would have probably not liked the strongly typed. You have to declare everything, and it's super, super strict. Like when I was starting out, I think I would have said, no, I don't want to declare it. I just want to be able to do whatever I want, because that's JavaScript, right? It's like the wild, wild west. We just do what we want. But as you go through, especially when you start, building larger applications and thinking about that architecture, it's better code. I mean, you could say, hey, I want to be able to change it on the fly, but when it's strict like that and it's very, very specific, your code is it's better quality code. Right. And then sometimes you have to write it wrong. You have to do it wrong first before you realize like why, paint yourself into a corner, and then you understand and you grow as a developer and you learn that kind of stuff. But I prefer to just do it wrong first and learn the hard way, because that's me. But now that I've done that, I really can personally appreciate the value in having that strongly typed strict stuff, because I'd rather find my bugs now rather than my users find my bugs later.
Well, one of the easiest patterns I can point to back in the old days would, if you were defining, say, controllers for use with a router so that they'd be combined with a template at some point, it was common to do angular.module name and then the controller, and then define the controller, all within typically a single closure, but that was all contained within a single file. And that's great, and that controller is effectively self-registering, right? Problem is you can never tell where the heck it came from. And if you try to reuse it, and reusing a controller, we all agree now, is a bad pattern. That's why components are so much better. But filters and pipes and services and the rest of that stuff, if you were trying to reuse those items, some other team owned it and they self-registered it to their own module, it started to become a lot more sticky. And so this type of pattern, I think, is a lot better.
Sorry, Denny.
No, that's great. Appreciate the input. And as you guys talk through that, it reminded me, it seems a bit counterintuitive initially when you're new to TypeScript and you're new to some of these new tools. But I repeatedly see the comment that it's a better developer experience when working with Angular versus AngularJS. And so just keep that in mind, that all of these things that may seem like a little bit of extra work or burden up front actually lead to a much better developer experience. So anyway, thanks, guys. I'm going to continue. The other area of upgrade costs in the area of time invested is the upgrade planning, right? So the first part of that is selecting an upgrade path. So we'll talk a little bit about this next, but there are several ways you can go from an AngularJS app to an Angular app. Then, of course, you need to design and install some sort of process. Depending on your team size and the application complexity, you need to devise an effective process to fit in your workflow and your organization to actually make the upgrade occur. You need to communicate with your team leaders and schedule things. It does require regular attention until that upgrade is complete. And then lastly, you need to manage the plan execution, right? So this will be including those upgrade tasks into your sprint cycles or your release cycles. So I mentioned earlier, we've got several upgrade paths. So we have our AngularJS app, and we know we want to get to an Angular version of it. So the first method would be just to perform an entire rewrite. That would mean essentially just creating a brand new Angular project and just kind of using the existing app as almost a requirement spec and just writing everything brand new in Angular. That's only going to be possible if you have a small app, and it's low risk, right? Another option is to refactor straight to Angular. This would involve using that upgrade module from Angular and simultaneously running your AngularJS app in an Angular environment or with an Angular code base, and then going through and refactoring all of your AngularJS pieces into Angular components. Another path would be to refactor towards Angular. This is going to make a lot of sense. This would be taking your AngularJS app along with AngularJS, so we're still using that upgrade, ng upgrade utility to run both code bases simultaneously. And then we go through and iteratively change or transform those AngularJS components into Angular components. And then lastly, we kind of combine the other two, the prior two options, which would be refactoring some parts of the AngularJS app into Angular components, and maybe just rewriting other parts just using Angular outright. So as a developer, we also want to think about why we would want to upgrade AngularJS app. And a look at it this way is at the top of this Venn diagram, we already have the AngularJS skill, and probably in the lower left there, we're learning about Angular. And of course, by going through an upgrade process, we would have to learn some Angular. And then if we add to that this ability to actually upgrade from JS to an Angular app, I think it puts us in a unique position where we actually have some unique marketplace values. So by forcing yourself to actually go through this with an app or two, I think it'd be tremendously beneficial for you as an individual developer because there's a lot of people out there that are going to need this kind of help. Some of the pros and cons of upgrading. The pros is that we can take advantage of the performance improvements. And if you have read anything about Angular, you'll notice that every single part of Angular was written with performance in mind. So not only was it written that way, but as new features come on board, performance is always a part of the discussion for anything that's being included with the Angular framework. So especially if you have a mobile app or something that's going to be used on tablets significantly, something that has limited resources, Angular is going to be a much better platform to host your app. There are some other powerful new features we'll talk about briefly. And then, of course, you can also position your app to leverage anything that comes out in the future, because AngularJS development is likely going to scale down at some point, and we know that Angular is kind of ramping up at this point. Some of the cons of upgrading is that you're going to have to spend the time to do the upgrade, and there is a lot to learn. It's going to take some careful planning and execution to make it happen. And if you have those third-party dependencies that are key to your app, you're really going to need to evaluate where you're going to get that functionality from in an Angular world. There's also some opportunity cost if we decide not to upgrade. First is we're going to miss out on some of the community advantages. We know that Angular is growing in popularity. There's going to be a lot more material out online, a lot more development, a lot more excitement in that community around Angular than there will be in AngularJS. So you'll miss out on being able to leverage some of the current activity in your peer group if we decide not to upgrade. Some of the new features of the platform may be really good candidates for your application. There's better change detection. There's a new approach that uses not just dirty checking to read the state, but it also mixes that with a concept called observables. So changes can be published to application components that are interested in those particular changes. There's also a feature called pre-compilation that's possible. So you can set up an Angular app so it's delivered to devices already compiled without the framework's compiler. So the footprint of your application is reduced significantly because you don't even need to deploy or ship the Angular compiler along with your app. And then there's also some improvements to the templating. It's still HTML, but it integrates better with these emerging standards of web components. So those standards are around custom elements, shadow DOM, templates, and packaging. And of course, if you're familiar at all with Angular, you know that each component it's kind of a custom element. So it fits nicely with one of those core web standards that are emerging at this point. It also reduces the number of directives through a more intuitive means of expressing views. And in general, I think the Angular platform has a lot less mental framework overhead that you have to carry with you. You don't have to memorize quite as many directives that are part of the framework, because there's an intuitive, almost predictable way to interface or get some of that same functionality. So we'll see a little bit of that later. There's also a feature called server-side rendering, which is more SEO friendly and actually allows you to run an Angular application outside of a browser. So you could run an application using Nodejs or as a web worker, which could also be used to speed up user interface. And then lastly, you'll miss out on the evolving platform. As I mentioned earlier, Angular is going to be used to meet not just current needs, but also future needs of applications and web and mobile applications. And we know that the Angular team has already proven trustworthy in its attention to supporting these emerging technologies and capabilities that are possible in web application development. And there will also be a growing number of third-party libraries in the Angular world as well. So that should help replace or cover those scenarios where your app might be dependent upon a third-party module for your AngularJS app. So Bonnie, did you have any other new features that you wanted to highlight?
Sorry, I was muted. As far as what would make them want to consider upgrading?
Yeah, just
how much time do we have? Because
just a little bit. Yeah,
I could go, but just briefly, the Angular CLI is amazing. There are so many things in the newer version, RxJS, NGRX, ahead of time compilation. Like, the features are endless. There's so many cool things that are available that you have in that. I mean, it's yeah. Don't get me started. I think Paul wanted to throw in something too, but there are a lot of cool. You guys know. I mean, there's so many cool features in Angular.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, did you want to chime in?
Yeah. So at this point, you've presented this like really great list and all these reasons why I should upgrade. And I'm thinking in the mindset of like the AngularJS developer who's like just about to ship. And I know you gave that list of considerations, but now I'm feeling bad for not using Angular instead of AngularJS, right? Do you have any recommendations, or can anyone here have had any experiences around like there's a certain point where it really is okay to not upgrade? I know we have like a kind of a standard spiel we give in our class where we say like, oh, if you're just about done and everything's working great, don't worry about it so much. But I'm just kind of curious as to like other people's thoughts on like, it really is okay to not upgrade. Like we don't want to guilt people into like sinking all this cost, like if it's not going to pay benefit. I wonder if you had any examples of trade-offs there where maybe it is okay to just stick with JS.
I could respond to that, or anybody.
Go ahead, Bonnie. Yeah.
So I would say, I mean, we have to respect the fact that there are customers out there who have put a lot of time and effort into building complex AngularJS applications. And I think, I mean, it's an investment of money, right? Sometimes the upper management is going to say, hey, you spent all this time building this. Now we have these features and they're working. Do we really want to spend a bunch more money into improving it? And so there is I think that's probably the most, like, time and money, right, would be the most, the biggest argument against upgrading is, hey, we have this, we've already built it and it's working, leave it alone. For me, I would say the offset of that, and it's kind of a balance. I mean, you have to respect both sides. Some people just have that investment, and and it's hard to come up with that money because they need to use that functionality. But on the flip side of it, time marches on and technology marches on, and we have all this functionality and all these features that are available. So I think, to me, that's the trade. That's like the pros and cons is the time and money we've already spent getting to this point versus the future functionality that we have.
Yeah, and I guess so. I'm kind of at that point with my company, and the way I'm viewing it is that it's time right now to get serious about planning, right? So I am looking to figure out how I can start working Angular into our application. And so during the series, we'll cover how you can make this happen right through those migration paths. But I kind of think that it's important enough to at least devise a plan for how you will get your app into its Angular state, depending on what kind of a lifetime you have planned for your app. If you only have a year of life planned for it, then it's not worth the effort. But if the app it's just being released and you have a long-term vision for it, I think it's worth the effort, even if you just released, to devise a plan for how to start transforming it.
So Denny, you're in your company, you're in charge of this upgrade process in your company, and you have a bunch of existing code that's there and multiple developers. Have you decided yet if you're going to go with the incremental or the big bang? Are you going to try and do it all at once, or are you going to try and do it? It sounds like you were going to try and do like one step at a time and start gradually. Is that right? Or do you not know yet?
I don't know for sure. We haven't decided. So still assessing that, trying to figure out where all the pieces are. But for instance, I know if we have some features that are somewhat isolated from one another. So we have certain areas of the product that are almost their own independent single page applications. So those are good candidates to almost work independently from all the rest of the AngularJS code that's out there. So I can make a plan to devise that part of the application on its own. Or if we've got a new feature that's just a single page, nothing with routing on it, my goal is to implement that new feature using Angular instead of AngularJS. So wherever possible, I'm looking to create anything new strictly in Angular and looking for ways to take what's already in AngularJS and make a upgrade path for it or a plan for it.
So you're going to do like a side-by-side hybrid thing?
I believe so, yes.
Can you just live stream that whole process, and then we can go through all the pain with you, and we can see how that works, and then if you make any mistakes, then we'll know not to do it like that.
Yeah, we'll come back in a year and see how much I've aged. Okay,
Jack,
anything?
do you want to jump in with anything?
I think a lot of good points have been made. I wanted to kind of reiterate that you're going to want to be learning a lot of these concepts anyway, either because you're going to be applying them in your new Angular applications, or you're going to be backporting them to your AngularJS applications. So all of the learning cost that you would potentially have as kind of a barrier to wanting to do this work is work you're going to want to do anyway. So I wouldn't let that like intimidation factor stop anyone from making this effort, because it's going to pay dividends regardless of whether you decide to continue on in AngularJS, or if you decide to upgrade, or if you decide to make a brand new Angular application.
And Denny, I think if I were watching this, probably the one thing that I would most want to see is, I mean, for any presentation, and maybe it's just me or maybe it's all of us, but I'm like, show me the code, right? Are we going to have at some point in this series, are we going to be able to see like what the hybrid would look like if you're like exactly what you said, you have the AngularJS code, a whole bunch of it, and then you want to add Angular 2. I think we have that planned.
Yes, yeah, that's going to be next week. We'll probably see a little bit of that with the tooling, but certainly in our final session where we walk through NG Rosetta, we're going to see that.
And NG Rosetta is literally going to show us like you can do both of them, and it'll walk through step by step, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was pretty excited when I saw that David had written that. I was like, I know that guy.
Okay. So real quick, one of the things I wanted to call out, AngularJS is not going away. right away. So while there is impetus to go to Angular, we also have a whole host of teams that are midstream in large-scale migrations to AngularJS. So Denny, you called out the, pulled out the example of where, I'm about to deploy. Okay, well, we've got that all over the place. We've got lots of teams that have been working for the last couple of years to migrate to AngularJS. And some of them started several years ago, and they aren't going to be done for several years because they've got so many thousands of pages. These are anomalies. These are large-scale enterprise applications that have thousands of pages to them. But the safety net that we have in place here is that the Angular team bifurcated themselves and gave some longevity to AngularJS. So you're still safe staying in AngularJS. There isn't the impending doom that it's going to go away. That was sort of the first impression that everybody had back when Angular 2 was officially announced. And I think they've done a good job. Not only communicating that message to the point where it's not even a thing anymore, nobody's worried about that I'm aware of, but there's also long-term support, there's long-term commitment, keeping things going, and they've done a good job keeping the cadence up for improvements, security fixes, enhancements in the 1X space. So that's worth calling out.
Yeah, thanks.
Those Angular team people are pretty awesome.
Right?
I like them.
Yes. Okay, thanks, guys. Appreciate the input. So that's our introduction. So what we learned is Angular is replacing AngularJS, certainly in what's being talked about in industry. There are migration paths, and that can facilitate our upgrade plan. So that's good. There is a way to get from our existing code to Angular. Learning Angular means learning the future of web application development. That's what Jack has mentioned. I think it's an excellent point that these are concepts. Angular uses these concepts that are the future of front-end development. But there are costs to consider, and there are also good reasons to upgrade, for developers individually, and then as well as our application users that will be able to benefit from our app's existence as an Angular app and instead of an AngularJS implementation.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
And then I'll be quiet and let you go through the rest of your slides. I wanted to mention something because when you said that learning Angular and learning how to do this upgrade, if you really want to have somebody that has that expertise, if you have a lot of code and you have, especially important things that can't go wrong, and you want to have that expertise, I wanted to just throw out there the mention that there are a couple of consulting firms that are actually doing this and that are happy to help you. And I know Paul and Jack know of at least one consulting firm. There are a couple. ThoughtRam I know can help with this. Narwhal I know can help with this, and Digital Oasis are three that I know of, and I'm sure there are more. But those are just the three where I have friends, and those are cool people that I know. So that's just one thing I wanted to throw out there, that there are people out there. And I know David Owen knows how to do it, but he's not for hire unless you're Thompson Routers, and then he can help you. But I just wanted to mention that, and I'll go back on mute and let you go back to your slides.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. Okay, so that's our series introduction. So next we want to take a look at the concepts that are introduced by Angular and compare them to what we know from AngularJS. I'm going to go ahead and launch that presentation.
Uh-oh.
Preparing. Okay, so in our second session, we want to look at Angular through our AngularJS lens. So we've just talked about the history of this series and how last year at this time, we were just learning about this new version of Angular. But this year, we need to try to figure out a way to get our production apps in industry upgraded. So in this session, we're going to do a side-by-side comparison of the AngularJS concepts we know with the Angular concepts and build an understanding of some of those key differences between the two, so that as we make our plans to upgrade, we feel comfortable with some of the concepts underneath this new framework.
And Denny, just for anybody following along, the plan is we're going to go through session 1 and 2 tonight, and then 3, 4, 5, and 6 will each be their own week, right?
That's correct. Yes. Thanks. Yep. So I want to take a look at each of these versions of the framework through the way that they present themselves online in the documentation. And if we look at the AngularJS website, the developer guide has this conceptual overview. And that conceptual overview breaks down AngularJS into these ideas, these concepts. But if we go to the Angular.io website, we have an architecture overview that's highlighted, and it appears there are many fewer concepts, many things that are missing. There's some overlap, but there are a lot of holes, it seems, and then there are also some new things in this Angular architecture. So let's take a look at those and see if we can figure out where those differences lie specifically. And I think that the framework, it's kind of divided into, these topics are divided into these 6 areas. So we'll go through them. So first, in a UI, we usually start with a view or a picture of how the app is going to appear. So in AngularJS, we start with that HTML template, and we add in some of those framework elements that support that part of the view that we're focused on. But in Angular, we start with a component that has its own template, right? So it's very streamlined. There's just that parity there between the two. And we don't have all these same concepts. So let's look back at AngularJS, and when we start with this template, we start writing HTML to present that UI, and then we add in some expressions to render static content. Then we might expose parts of the application model through some dynamic bindings. And then, of course, that has to be supported by some JavaScript, right, where we've got our variables. Then we might add in some business logic, like, whenever a user clicks this button, calculate this product. That also has the JavaScript to actually execute that that process for us. And that, of course, is going to be wrapped in a controller then. But what is it that links these two together in AngularJS, right? Well, that's the scope, right? So this scope is key in linking some part of our HTML to some JavaScript behind that HTML. So let's do a quick review. A scope is just a plain old JavaScript object. And I had to be reminded of this because I'm so used to seeing its complexity in the developer tools when I'm debugging. But it's just an object. And AngularJS, the framework, generates a single scope object at the point of bootstrapping, that ng app directive, and it calls that its $root scope. So that's one scope object that's at the top of our application. And then the framework also generates others for certain directives, like our ng controller or the ng repeat. And the result of that then is this hierarchy of scopes. And those child scopes are anything that are underneath that root scope. Those are where we surface our model properties. And depending on how we configure those scopes, of course, it limits and dictates how certain model properties are available throughout the DOM. So we use the scope for to provide a reference to our application model, right? So we have an object there, and we have maybe an application view where we don't necessarily want to expose the entire object. We just want to expose a part of our application model to the view. When we do that using this $scope. Another thing we use the scope for is to provide an execution context for our expressions. So if we have some JavaScript and we have an object here with some properties and we have a function, our view, whatever part of the DOM is tied to this particular scope object, is going to reflect those values and provide access to this particular instance of a function. Another thing we use the scope for is to provide an API to observe model mutations using a $watch. So if we take a simple circle calculations app here, and we say we've got this radius, let's say we've got an NG model binding on this radius input, and we've got this set up right now so that anytime a user clicks calculate, it's going to go ahead and generate these calculations and output them here underneath. Well, what if we wanted to automate that and wanted to remove that calculate button so that the user did not have to manually initiate the recalculation? We could actually use a watch and manually register that so that anytime that radius binding, this value up here in the input field changes, it's automatically going to fire our recalculation. So that's another thing we use our scope for. Another function we get from that is to manually initiate change detection when we know we have to do that. So if we're using a third-party library like jQuery's date picker, and we know that anytime somebody selects a new value, we want to go ahead and update our model. We know that we have to manually fire the apply function to make sure that the Angular change detection process detects that and processes it. And then lastly, we use that scope to propagate events throughout our app, right, to broadcast and emit. So if we got some part of our DOM here, we've got children that use the emit to send custom events up to their parents. We've got parents that send broadcasted custom events downward towards children. And we attach these listeners using our scope to these various parts of the DOM so they can react to those events. So we've got these 5 important things that we're used to using scope for in AngularJS apps. So how is something like this possible when we move to Angular? So when I first started seeing talks about this coming Angular 2, I was kind of alarmed by these types of images because I didn't understand how such a core part of the framework could simply disappear. So I think to answer that, we'll look at how we do view composition in Angular. So in Angular, if we start with HTML, we actually can't. We have to start immediately with both an HTML as along with some component class, and that component class is going to be in TypeScript. So already we see we've got to have some code and some template that are somehow connected. Then we go ahead and write our template expressions in a very similar way that we're used to. We introduce class properties, though, not just random variables attached to an arbitrary scope, but we introduce class properties. These are members of this component class. And then we add our UI logic in a similar way, but that method has to be connected to a member method within this component class. So then the question is, how do these two connect or get connected? And that's done through a decorator function. And decorator functions are what are used in Angular to tell the framework how to connect and process the various parts of your Angular app. So without the scope, how is Angular going to do these 5 things that we lean on in AngularJS? So first off, the application model reference. Well, we reference the application model simply through those component class properties. Whatever class is bound to that component HTML, its members are automatically available for use in the view. Secondly, we have provision for the execution context. In Angular, the execution context is just derived naturally from that component class, and that whatever methods are member methods on that class. So there's no need to introduce this additional layer of functional scope from the framework any longer, because it simply is the class that's connected to that template. So how do we observe model mutations like we did with our calculator? Well, in Angular, there's a library within it called Zone.js, which completely eliminates the need to ever manually set up watchers for model mutations. So let's take a look at that in our prior example. So if we have a circle calculator component now, and it has the same properties that our prior example had, and essentially the same method, a recalculate, what does the HTML look like to make sure that the change is detected each time that radius value changes? Well, it's as easy as adding this line, change, recalculate. This essentially just says anytime this value changes, fire that recalculate method. So another thing we've used scope for is to manually initiate change detection. NGZone, it's an instance that is actually an extension of the Zone.js that we mentioned just prior, that completely eliminates the need to ever manually initiate change detection as well. We'll talk more about that later in this series. And then lastly, propagating events throughout our app. We used to do it through broadcasting and emitting, but that's been replaced in Angular with event emitters and observables. So in Angular, we simply create an event emitter and send those out from children to their parents. And we simply register a click event handler to that custom event, or sorry, not a click event, but a custom event handler to respond to that event. We have parents can communicate with their children through custom events by firing observable next. And then we just have various areas of the DOM that subscribe to those custom events to be able to respond to them. Now, I think the one difference here is that with Angular, we can emit events to their direct parent, and the parent can respond as we see here. However, I don't think that this custom event will pass to its grandparent. I think that you have to actually subscribe to that custom event from that parent element if you want to receive and process that custom event at that point as well. Anybody on the panel want to confirm or refute that?
Yeah, that's right. So if you emit a component event from that lower level LI, it's only going to be emitted one level up, so to that UL. So if you want to propagate events on a wider scale, you need to go through another mechanism other than that. That's really only intended for short-range communication between a parent and child component.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it.
But you can continue to use observables in the other direction. You kind of have that outlined here by saying my event $.subscribe. On the left, you can certainly do that here as well. You can have the parent subscribe to an observable that you put data in from the LI.
Okay.
Right. It's like a separate mechanism that you would use.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, right. It won't jump through or pass through that UL that's shown.
There
Okay.
are a few different ways to, I really like shared services too, if you're trying to get something from one place to another. I think the big thing that changed for me going from AngularJS to Angular with particular this with the scope, with event emitters, broadcast, and just changing, making anything go from one component to another, whether it's up or down. I think the way I would explain it with AngularJS, like everything could hear everything and everything went everywhere, right? And for this, for the newer Angular, it's much more specific and intentional. It just doesn't like everything's everywhere with the scope. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah, I'd iterate that last word, intentional. Like everything has intentionality behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. So another thing that has been eliminated from the framework is controllers. And that's also obviously a key component of our AngularJS apps. So how can they do that, right? So we use controllers to add our UI logic, where we declare constructor functions and then register them with the module. But in Angular, there's no such thing as a controller. Instead, we declare classes that have their own constructors, right? So there's no need to construct or define a separate constructor function. It's implicit. It's tied to whatever component we are developing a view for. And as far as the registration with the module, we use that decorator function, and the metadata in that, we'll see in a little bit, is what registers a particular components with the module. So we see that here. This at component is a decorator function, and it will have its own keys, not just the selector, but it has additional metadata that you may use to configure and define how Angular should interpret the following class. So how does that affect the model that views reference to the application model, right? So in AngularJS, we connect those variables that are in our controllers through that scope object, right? But in Angular, we just connect those data members that are part of our components class directly to the view template that is configured with the component. So we see here the difference. On the left for AngularJS, we see that we have to manually attach a comparison variable to the scope. Whereas on the right, all we have to do is refer to the member property of the class through its constructor. So expressions are also a key part of our templates in AngularJS, and they're just JavaScript-like code snippets that are in our template where we've got our interpolation bindings. And of course, the evaluation context of those expression is decided and influenced by the scope that's in effect at the DOM of that particular location. So in Angular, we still have these JavaScript-like code snippets throughout our templates, but there's a distinction that's made between template expressions and template statements. So a template expression produces a string value. That's probably what we're used to as most of the time these interpolation bindings that we're familiar with in AngularJS. But in Angular, a template statement is used to describe something that responds to an event. So it would be like a click handler or some other JavaScript-like statement that can be executed. And the evaluation context is always the component instance. So when we look at templates, the way they're described between the two different frameworks, we have on the AngularJS side, they described them as HTML that contains AngularJS specific elements and attributes. But in Angular, they describe it as a form of HTML telling Angular how to render components. So that's a little bit different. It implies almost that there's not quite the similarities to HTML that we might be used to. I think that where we see this manifest is in directives. So because of the way Angular has changed its syntax, they've been able to eliminate a lot of the directives that we had to pull out of the library for very specific effects through attribute inclusions on our templates. So we would add, NGClick or NGClass, and we'd be stringing together all these NG-directives, which as attributes that only Angular's framework would be able to understand and would interpret and process during compilation. But with Angular, there's really some more intuitive, cleaner syntax that once you learn, you'll see eliminates a lot of the bulk, and it eliminates the need for all of those custom attribute names that were introduced by AngularJS. So one of the biggest differences in templates is what it really means. A template in AngularJS can be any part of your DOM that's an HTML section or segment that we add this markup to, and it compiles into a view. But in Angular, anything at all, any HTML that's rendered out to your view, it has to be a part of a component. So the Angular markup types that we have are very similar still between the two frameworks. We have interpolation bindings and directives. It's really just some of the syntax that changes. And then for expressions, we've got, of course, our evaluation context, which is the scope in AngularJS. Our text bindings we're used to with interpolation. And for directive attributes, we know that we can assign our function handlers to directives that are built in to the framework, like NGClick, or we can create our custom directives where we pass in objects to them. And then we also have filters in our AngularJS templates where we simply format the way that our data is displayed. But in Angular, we've got these template expressions that produce values. They have some similarities in the text bindings, but the evaluation context is always that component instance instead of an arbitrary scope object. And then we see some real differences in the property binding area. So instead of having a built-in directive attribute that's part of our expression, we've got this property binding which can support standard HTML, something like the hidden property on an HTML element you can assign a class property value to, or you can assign custom input like a product object you could assign to that. Now notice what's key to notice here is that these are identical. The reference, the syntax is identical whether or not you are referring to an object like this custom product or a built-in HTML element. And this is where we see some of the simplification show up in the way that Angular is written versus AngularJS, where we would have to write our own custom directive almost to pass in this custom object. And then they also have this new concept, this new syntax called a template reference, where we can mark any part of our DOM with a hashtag name or label, and then we can refer to that throughout the template. And then we have template statements where we simply respond to events. So this is our click handling. And instead of filters, we have what are called pipes, but they have very similar syntax. We'll talk a little bit more about pipes in a bit. Here we have some common things we see in our templates. We have event handling, where instead of NGClick, we're using this parentheses notation to notify Angular that there's an event there, a click event we want to respond to. We have iterative templates, which instead of using ng repeat, we just have this ng4, but the concept is very similar. We have variable bindings, those are done identically, and then we have this template reference that I just mentioned. So when we look at these views and how we compose them in AngularJS, we look to start with some part of our HTML, typically, where we write controllers to provide functionality, then bind those controllers with scopes, adding in the variables and functions to support that view. And then we rely on two-way data binding to propagate those model mutations throughout our app. And the result of all that is the scope hierarchy that represents that application model and its current state. But in Angular, a view composition begins with that component. We've got to design a component, and that immediately implies that we have careful thought of what it's going to look like presented and what is the code behind it, that is its class implementation with very specific properties and functions. In Angular, we're actually guaranteed the source of those model mutations through one-way bindings, and we'll see a little bit of this later. So we arrange and combine components, and we have to declare our inputs and outputs to those components manually, or I shouldn't say manually, but explicitly. So in Angular, as was mentioned earlier, all of the data flow is very intentional and is strongly controlled by the developer. So you won't be able to set up your app in the same way as AngularJS, where you're not sure where your data is coming from. So you have to explicitly define each component, what it's going to receive as an input and what it's going to emit as an output. And the result of that is a tree of components that you've probably heard talked about in Angular context. So just by taking a look at the way that views are composed, we've covered a lot of these topics from AngularJS, but we've really only looked at a couple of the ones from this Angular framework. So next, let's take a look at some of the others we're familiar with: directives, filter, and services. So for directives, we know that to define a directive, we have to define a directive definition object, and we know that that can be a complex set of descriptions to tailor exactly how we want our directive to behave and respond in the way that we want it to. So we had to learn all about that configuration. And then we also have to pay special attention to how we define our scope for every directive, right? Is it going to be an isolate scope, or is it going to inherit or create a new one? All of that is required in AngularJS whenever we create a custom directive. But in Angular, we don't have a directive definition object at all. Instead, we use a metadata object that goes into a directive decorator plus whatever our class definition is to actually create a directive. And there are three types of directives. So one is the component itself. It's a very special component, and it has both a template along with its directive, or along with its class definition. Then we also have structural directives, and a structural directive is something like an ng repeat, something that can actually change the structure of the DOM. It produces or removes DOM elements. And then there's also attribute directives, which simply modify the appearance or behavior of some existing DOM. So if you had a directive that might highlight a particular area of your DOM. So in AngularJS, we know we had filters, and filters have been replaced by a concept called pipes. We can still create custom pipes just like we created custom filters, but to create a custom pipe, we have to define a class that implements that pipe transform interface, and that's done simply by adding in this implements keyword pipe transform, and then making sure that we implement this transform method within our class. And then that's simply registered in our declarations for our module. but the use is exactly the same. So they'll appear in our templates the same way. So we also have services in Angular. They still support application logic, but of our components. While there are many types in AngularJS, in Angular, really just any function or feature needed by the application. We don't have to manage mentally the distinction between all these different flavors of services that we have in AngularJS. And the way we register services with the module is simply by marking them with this @injectable decorator. So next, let's take a look at the concept of module in each one of these frameworks. When I first started learning AngularJS, I know I saw a diagram like this from Dan Wallin. So modules are described as containers for all the different types of AngularJS elements within your app, right? And we've got some configuration here. We've got providers of different types, the controllers and directives. And that all looks like this when we put it together and register our module and use helper functions. We can combine or we can declare all the different parts of our app using this angular.module method. But that's also something that's been removed from the framework. So to understand how that's possible, let's look at Angular's approach to modules. And modules in Angular are described as cohesive blocks of code. And I think what's a little bit different in Angular versus AngularJS is they have organized the parts that go into a module in these 4 categories: imports, providers, declarations, and this bootstrap here. So the imports are going to be any other NG module or any other NG module that contains classes that are needed by code that's inside of this module. Providers are any of the services that are defined and implemented within this module. Declarations are going to be any of the view classes from this specific module. And then the root component is something that only appears in your main application view to declare how to bootstrap your Angular app. So that looks quite a bit different with those 4 categories than what we may be used to. But if we look at our AngularJS registration, I think we can see some signs of the same items. So if we look up at the top where we're used to registering dependencies for our module, we can see that these would be the third-party libraries that we rely upon, that external code that this module needs. So we have imports represented here. And then we've got our controllers, directives, filters. Those are kind of what are lumped together in our declarations now for Angular. And then we've also got our services, which are listed here as providers. So I think they're all there. It's just a little bit cleaner organization. And there's some other things we use angular.module for. We determine the app entry point. We declare dependencies. But in Angular, we use the ES6 module system, which is importing and exporting items from different files to group them together and to mark what external code is necessary. The app entry point is declared by that bootstrap meta key for the root module. Dependencies for the dependency injector are declared as providers or imports for the module. And we can see that everything is a class, and the decorators around those classes describe how Angular is going to interpret that code. And then lastly, we use Angular module to establish a configuration and to run our module. So in Angular, it uses the decorator function to declare, which is the very top, the entry component. And we do the configuration simply through the constructors of that. So if you have a constant that your app relies upon, you can simply inject that into the constructor for your module. And there's one other thing that has been completely eliminated from the AngularJS framework when we moved to Angular, and that's the JQ-Lite. So in AngularJS, JQ-Lite was used to ensure this cross-browser compatibility, and it was also used to increase the speed of some of the DOM activity. But in Angular, there's no DOM wrappers at all within the framework code. It deals directly with raw DOM and its API. And the reason they can do that is the need for the browser compatibility layer has diminished somewhat since AngularJS was created, and the speed has improved. But you can still build your own components using jQuery if you like. So we covered modules. Now let's look at dependency injection. So I think we kind of know what the benefits of dependency injection are. We abstract away knowing exactly how objects are resolved to all the things that need them during runtime. But what's key here is how do we register and make use of that system within AngularJS. Within AngularJS, we write our constructor functions, label them with string tokens, and then register those tokens and attach them to those functions through that module. Then we apply configuration throughout our code to declare those dependencies. But in Angular, we just write classes. We include constructor functions with typed parameters in those classes to declare those dependencies. And then we include those class names as providers in the module or component metadata for the decorator. So the registration process for AngularJS, everything is registered in that module. And there are some nuances to registering different services, whether it's an injectable factory method or a constructor function. You've got the constructor function for controllers. And then there's these rules you have to follow about what you can inject where and the module's run method versus config method. So you have to carry all that with you as a developer. But in Angular, everything's registered in a module or component provider list. So it's only one way that things are registered. And we can see that here. We've got the NG module with its providers for logger service, and then you've got a component that depends on a hero service that is registered in the same way, a provider's key in the metadata for the decorator of the class. So if we look at this in an AngularJS world, we see this is just creating or registering the service. So if we have a hero controller that relies on a hero service, we set all that up and define it. And then we actually have three options for how we tell AngularJS that that controller depends on the service. So the first is we can add it as a property array annotation to the hero controller. The second option is to do inline array annotation. And the third is to do implicit annotation. So in Angular, it's as easy as simply typing the service for the constructor of your component. So this hero component requires the use of this hero service. And just by putting this hero service here, along with the provider from the previous slide, the dependency injection system will know to provide a hero service to this component. So you can see some of the simplification there. Another big difference is the injector itself. In AngularJS, there's only one injector, regardless of how many modules you have in your app, and it's flat. So it's a simple list of token names to controllers and constructor functions that's maintained by the framework. But in Angular, it's actually hierarchical, which means there are multiple injectors. Every single component gets its own injector. And so when a grandchild component needs to find or needs to use a certain service, for example, it will actually look to itself first if it's provided, and then up the chain until it finds an instance of that service. So how would this be used? Well, it can be used for something called service isolation. So you imagine that you've got some kind of an accounting app, and it has an accounts receivable part and an accounts payable part to it. And to support those parts, maybe you've got a receivable service and a payable service. So if we want to make those services application-wide, which would mean that the payable component would have, and of course anything underneath it, would have access to all the services, both payable and receivable, we would inject both of these services into the app module. And so this would allow any code within either of these components to access any of the services. That might be okay, but maybe there's certain functionality that you just don't even want to cross those boundaries of receivable versus payable. Well, with this hierarchical dependency injection, you can actually inject the receivable service into the receivable component and the payable service into the payable component, and then neither of these would have access to the service that you don't want them to access. And in code, it looks very simple to set up. It's simply a matter of shifting the providers from the module, NG module declaration providers, into the component providers individually. So we see here we've got an empty providers list, and then each of the components has the service provided at the level that they need it. So next we'll talk about the compiler. The compiler in AngularJS, we know it parses the syntax, and there's two phases to it. It compiles and then it links. So the compile phase is when it grabs all of the directives and then links together all of those in the second phase. For Angular, it parses all the component templates and produces its views. But there are actually two options in Angular for compilation. There's the just-in-time compiler, and there's the AOT, or the ahead-of-time compiler. So for a just-in-time compilation means that the compilation runs within the browser, right? So your app is downloaded, and the Angular framework then starts interpreting your code and generates its output. But there are side effects to that, right? It means that your application code size is going to increase because you've got to ship the AngularJS framework compiler along with your own code to make that happen. There can be performance decreases as it needs time to actually do the compiling. And the worst part is for your users, the errors, any errors in compilation can only be discovered at application runtime. You can't predict them in advance as a developer. So Angular also has a just-in-time compiler, and right now that's the default compiling mode. But remember, I mentioned that everything in Angular is designed with performance improvement in mind. So even this is faster in Angular than it was or is in AngularJS. This is the default compiling mode, but that may be changing as of the very next release. So keep your eye out for that, because the next type of compiling is ahead-of-time compiler. And this means that the compiler is not deployed with your application. The compilation would only occur when you build the app. So when you deploy it, that part of the framework is not bundled with your app. There's some additional build setup, but the benefits are fantastic. First of all, your app is going to render faster because a big part of the framework is not even shipped, downloaded with your app to the client. So it's smaller size, and you can detect any compilation errors long before your users. And that leads to better security as well, because you're never compiling anything in the client. So there would be no way for somebody to do injection script attacks. So last but not least, we want to take a look at data binding and how that's the same and differs between the two frameworks. So we know that data binding is very convenient because all we have to do is declare bindings and manage our model, and the framework handles the synchronization through binding, right? And that binding, that data binding is implemented or supported by the change detection process. So we want to think about when does that model really change? So the answer to that question will dictate when change detection should even run at all. And if we think about it, we can figure out that the model can really only change anytime the user interacts with the app, like they click a mouse button, or some network event occurs, so some data is returned from a server. We might want to display that. Or some scheduled event occurs, like a timer has expired and some callback manipulates the model as a result of that timer expiration. So we know if we look at those, all three of those are asynchronous events. So change detection only needs to run in response to asynchronous events. And in AngularJS, we celebrated two-way binding, right? So this drawing is on the website, and it was great. Initially, we thought we could just set up our data and not think about the flow between our view and model. But as our applications grew, we learned that that's quite a headache to manage and maintain because we lose track of where things are changing. In Angular, unidirectional data flow is preferred. And in fact, there are very explicit directional descriptions of how the model values travel from the DOM to the component class and vice versa. So even the two-way binding at the bottom of this image here is just the two-way binding between the DOM of the component and its class, right? This is not the two-way binding of AngularJS where you can change a value or an object and several components over, the value changes over there as well. So in AngularJS, two-way bindings mean that we can impact any part of our application. So the process itself has to go through at least twice to verify that the model has stabilized, because you could have a child update a parent after that parent has already been checked. In Angular, we're going to it uses the top-down single execution dirty checking. Each component has its own change detector. There are actually ways to configure change detectors in a way that will limit the change detection from even occurring. So if there's a certain part of your component or a component that you know will not change, you can configure the framework to not even bother checking it, which can optimize your app even further. The result is going to be a very clean single fire run from top to bottom each time change detection runs. And since there's no risk of a child updating a parent model value, there's no need for it to run twice. So how do they do that? Well, in AngularJS, the dirty checking or the way that change detection is triggered is by hooking into the browser's event loop, this $apply that we have to call manually. In AngularJS, without it, we'd simply have an on-click handler that would register a callback into the browser's event loop, right? But when we attach AngularJS, we use this NGclick directive that is actually transformed by the compiler into something that looks like this, which is a scope.apply wrapper around that same callback. And so we see that even the NGclick directive itself is simply doing the extra work of wrapping our callback into something that allows us to enter that AngularJS context. And this is what this is why we know that change detection is fired whenever we use NGclick. And then of course we know that sometimes we have to explicitly call $apply anytime we're using third-party libraries, right? So AngularJS, we know, introduces its own event processing loop that goes through this watch list that can grow and cause performance degradation. It goes through that list looking for anything that may have changed. And of course, it's fast, but it's unpredictable due to the two-way binding that it relies upon or it allows. So in Angular, the change detection process actually intercepts the browser event loop process through something called monkey patching. The zone.js is what monkey patches all of the asynchronous browser APIs. And what that means is that it's going to track or keep a reference to the original DOM API functions like add event listener or set timeout. It keeps references to them, and then it replaces them with a proxy version by the same name. That proxy version provides hooks into that callback to report or to allow you to detect or attach to whenever that process starts, ends, or errors out. And then it simply delegates to the native version of that app. So the other thing it does is it wraps that callback in this zone proxy wrapper. So similar to our NGClick example from AngularJS, where your callback is wrapped in a scope $apply. This zone.js is actually going to wrap your callback in some zone proxy wrapper that gives it information about where it came from, that asynchronous event. So Angular then extends that zone.js with an implementation called NGzone. So an NGzone, it adds, the framework does this for us. The framework adds a custom event called onMicroTaskEmpty. That was formerly known as onTurnDone. So when you're looking at things online, talks, articles, you may see this onTurnDone event referred to. That's been updated recently to something called onMicroTaskEmpty. What you want to know and remember is that this event is occurs whenever a callback is finished executing. So whenever your calculate function completes, this onMicroTaskEmpty is fired. And then Angular keeps a reference to your application that subscribes to that event. So anytime that event is received, it initiates change detection. And so that's how we're assured that change detection will occur anytime we call even a native API function because of this monkey patching through zones. This turns out to be a much faster process, 3 to 10 times faster, and most important, it's predictable because there's not that two-way binding. So in Angular, we might be familiar with this drawing from their online documentation, where we see this event loop, and the $apply function is how we enter the change detection process for AngularJS. So in Angular, we have something that looks like this, and I'm going to walk through this with a laser pointer. So on the left, we still have this native execution context, and then we have our Angular application and framework over here on the right. So let's start here in this box, and this calls to async processors. So this would be a timer or a click event or a network request that is completed. Anything that occurs within our application code that we've written, a response to a click event, right? Anytime that occurs, that event is passed through this NGzone, which relies upon zone.js that provides all of those patched web APIs. So none of our async processes can reach the event queue without going through this zone.js. And that means that everything that reaches the event queue will be wrapped in a zone with some zone proxy information that tells that labels where that event originated from. So when the callback is executed, it's returned through the zone.js, the NGzone, and the NGzone's extensions of zone.js fire that event. So I've labeled it here on task done emit. That's that on micro task empty event that we mentioned from the prior slide. So it's simply an event that's emitted each time a callback is completed. And the Angular framework has a reference to your application that listens to that and simply calls this tick function. The result of that tick function is just to kick off a downward trend where each change detector from each component from the top of your tree down to the bottom is fired. That eventually results in updating of all of your views, and those are passed to the DOM renderer. So the key to this is that all asynchronous processes can't reach the event queue of your browser without going through this Zone.js monkey patching API. So the impact of that is that in AngularJS, where we must manually wrap some of those events with $apply to make sure that change detection is fired, and we have to use special versions of a timeout service to make sure our timers can change our model without missing out on change detection. The impact of monkey patching with zones is that we don't ever have to think about that. That's completely transparent to us as Angular developers because we can use the native APIs as is and be assured that the Zone.js library will intercept that and make sure that change detection is fired when those callbacks are complete. Another possibility with this Zone.js is you can actually run multiple applications simultaneously in the same browser. I haven't done this, but this is one of the amazing things you can do with Zone.js. It's really a mind-blowing feature, and it's a little bit difficult to get your head around. But you don't need to understand its inner workings just to write Angular, but it's a pretty fascinating concept, and I'd invest a little bit of time reading about it just so you understand why you no longer have to worry about these timeout services and worry about registering third-party application code or including $apply whenever you're using third-party library code. So that's it. So we just scratched the surface in many of these areas, but hopefully you have a better understanding of how some of the Angular concepts, the AngularJS concepts that you're familiar with already show up in Angular. And also we covered some of the amazing new features in Angular that aren't available in AngularJS. So you may have a place for them in your apps. So we learned that there are many differences between the two platforms. But Angular is useful for the same reasons we adopted AngularJS, right? And it's even more powerful, and it's easier to adopt in many ways because it applies an intuitive pattern, intuitive syntax, and intuitive patterns to accomplish a lot of the work that we're familiar with. So
that was pretty amazing.
Yeah,
I thought for a minute there you were going to lose your voice at the end. I know. That was such a good overview.
I ran out of water. So I do want to mention just quickly our next session. In our next session, we're going to cover the new development environment, where we take a look at the new infrastructure and the tools that we're going to need just to begin developing in Angular. So keep your eye out on Twitter at NG_Houston, and then subscribe to our channel, NG Houston, our Angular meetup, and stay aware of news regarding when that's going to be. But for right now, we expect that to be 1 week from today, the 12th of September at 6 p.m. or 6:30 p.m. Central Time.
And Denny, all those slides that you just went through, are you going to make those available to people watching?
You certainly can, yes.
If you can tweet them out and tag NG Houston, I'll retweet them.
Okay.
And I know Jack and Paul have been listening. You guys have anything you want to add? I know we ran over our time, but that was a lot of really good information.
Yeah, no, that was actually really, really well done as far as that comparison and breakdown. I'm just kind of like nodding along, like you're bang on the whole time. The only thing I would add at all is like that zone information that was really good, but like in your workaday kind of stuff, like you largely don't have to care about Zone.js, and that was kind of the point of why Angular brought it in. So like it's good to know the background of that, but in practice, it's something you rarely have to think about, if ever.
No, that's a good point, and you're right. I don't want that to dissuade anyone from moving to Angular, but it's amazing. It's an amazing part of the framework, I think.
Khalid on the chat was asking if we recommend upgrading to AngularJS 1.5 components before moving apps to Angular or going straight into the upgrade. And I think we kind of covered that at the beginning. I personally would generally say yes. I would try to get, and I think that's what Paul and Jack were saying at the beginning too, is you want to try to bring it into the components before you, and like get everything ready, get the structure there. So you're going to write your AngularJS in an Angular way and then roll into the upgrade. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and we'll cover that a little bit in one of the later sessions as well, how to start thinking in that way. That's in our 4th session, where that just rewriting that in Angular 1.5 will help you start to think in the way that you need to be effective as an Angular developer.
Right. And if you're watching this and you're not, because we have people asking questions in the live chat, but if you're watching this as a recording and it's not a live chat, I created a hashtag. It's hashtag Angular Upgrade Series, because I'm not that creative. So Angular Upgrade Series, if you guys have questions in between weeks and you want us to try to address them, go ahead and tweet with that hashtag, and then we'll keep an eye on that that hashtag and try to get those questions answered as we go along. We have 5 more sessions. And Denny, we're going to try, pending hurricanes, we're going to try and do these back-to-back every Tuesday night, right?
That's right.
Awesome. Okay, I think, is that it for tonight? You want to take off your screen share, Denny, and say goodnight? I think that was really great. You did a lot of work.
Yes, let me do that.
Yeah, by the way, I'm going to steal your slide on like, here are the things to consider whenever you head into your upgrade process. Because that was like right on also. We're like, yeah, that's exactly what we want to convey. That's awesome. It's a good slide there.
Thanks.
Thanks for that.
We should steal his whole presentation.
May as well, yeah.
No, it's public. I hope it helps. I mean, that's why we're doing this series, is because there's a lot of people out there, even myself, we know that we're in a certain position and we want to get somewhere and we need help. So.
Well, those slides are amazing. I think a lot of people will find them helpful. And yeah, come back every week, because this is just part 1. We did part 1 and part 2 tonight. We went a little bit over, but it was cool. So, and then we'll do part 3, 4, 5, and 6 in the next 4 weeks, over the next 4 weeks.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you guys.
Thank you, Denny. This was awesome. And thank you, Paul and Jack. And I know David had to leave, but he will be back with his Rosetta, NG Rosetta. And we have some more guests, some more panelists, and lots more upgrade goodness. So thank you again, Denny. This was really cool. And we will see you guys next Tuesday.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks for having us.